Oh, Jenny, the crackly happened even just now. Maybe it's just me, just when the computer said we're recording. So maybe
Oh,
it's my own issue, hopefully. Anyway,
yeah.
we are delighted to have Jenny Woods here with us to talk about volunteers in museums. It's a conversation I have with so many of you as I'm out visiting the state. We need more volunteers. We need diverse volunteers. How do we engage with our volunteers? How do we manage our volunteers? And it's such a crucial part of how we keep our organizations healthy and strong. And so I was really excited to invite Jenny. She is the past president, immediate past president of the American Association of Museum Volunteers. I will also share that link in the chat so that you can all go to their website. There's a lot of great resources there, and maybe you want to join the organization. But it's sort of an added bonus that Jenny is also a Washingtonian. She is the museum services coordinator for the Seattle Art Museum when she's not supporting the AAMV, right?
Correct.
Perfect.
Yes.
So Jenny, we're so happy to have you here. I want everybody on the call to know that this is just sort of a starting point, and Jenny and I have talked about sort of what happens next for this conversation. So this is going to be kind of high level, but then based on questions and concerns that come out of our conversation today, we may very well find that there needs to be a follow-up session on something more specific. You may have specific concerns that don't get addressed today, so feel free to shoot me an email and let me know, and we can talk about what it would look like to do a training around that. And we also know that lots of folks in this Zoom space have a lot of experience working with volunteers. So feel free to not just share questions in the chat, but share things that have worked well for you, successes you've had. We all want to learn from that as well. Okay, with all of that, I'm going to mute myself and stop talking and hand it over to Jenny.
Great. Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen and launch a PowerPoint so we have something fun to look at. Oh, except for I need to do this. Okay. And slideshow. Here we go. There's always the fumbling, isn't there, when you're trying to do these things? Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see my slides. Oh, I've got a thumbs up. Perfect. Yes, so I'm calling this Volunteer Management 101. We are going to be talking about some just basic structure of volunteer programs, and I have tried to really think in particular about how this might be useful for small museums and organizations, but I think a lot of these things apply across the board. So, and there we go. Yes, we have sort of already heard some of my qualifications. I will say, just so we're clear, at my role at Seattle Art Museum, I don't actually work in the volunteer program at Seattle Art Museum. There's a whole story. We don't have time to get into it, but anyway, but I do know a lot about volunteerism because I have spent over 20 years working with volunteers in museums. And then I also do some museum volunteer program consulting with other groups. So something to keep in mind. And the easiest way to reach me is probably through the AAMV membership1@gmail.com. And I've included that in the resources at the end as well. But if you're not aware of AAMV, or American Association for Museum Volunteers, definitely check us out. We do have a lot of resources, and our whole goal is to help people who work with volunteers in museums. And we try to think about the best ways for that to happen. So check us out if you haven't heard of our organization before. But yes, this is what we're going to do today. Just a little bit of a framework of volunteer program. I'm going to touch on volunteer recruitment, retention, and recognition very briefly. I could do a whole presentation on that for an hour if you wanted me to. So this will just be a taste of recruitment, retention, and recognition. I've got a couple of resources to share, and I do want to leave a healthy amount of time at the end for questions and answers at the end. But first, I've got some questions for you, and Allison is going to help me launch a poll. We're going to do two polls so I can get a sense of you guys. And I think first up, give me a sense of the size of the volunteer program you have at your organization, whether you don't have any volunteers at all, or you've got lots and lots of them. And we'll just give a couple seconds. Jump in there, give us an answer. When we've got the majority of you, we'll call it. We'll give it just a couple more seconds for those folks who are just finding their mouse and clicking on the right thing. All right, that's like 87% of you have answered. So looks like we've got a lot of small volunteer groups. 68% are less than 20. And then 11% in the 21 to 50, 6% in the 50 to 100, and 14% of you 100 plus. Okay, great. That is fantastic. Let's do one more poll. And this, I want to know if you yourself are a staff member, a paid staff member at your organization, or a volunteer at your organization. Hold on, we're having some technical difficulties. Okay, there we go. Now we don't have technical. There it is. All right, go ahead and let us know if you're a volunteer or paid. Oh, you guys are on it. Those numbers are rolling in. All right, 90% of you have responded, and well, it's pretty. So we've got about 59% of you are volunteers, and 41% of you are paid staff. So almost even, or close to even. That's great. So I will definitely try to speak to both of those things when there's a difference. And sometimes there isn't a difference, but there are occasions where it is different if you've got paid staff versus just volunteer staff at your organization. So, all right, I think I'm going to close that, and I think we can move along to framework of a volunteer program. And the place I always start when I'm thinking about how to think about a volunteer program is literally what the volunteers do. And I think that the most important thing, if there's one takeaway from today for you, it should be, do you have written position descriptions for each of your volunteers? And if you don't, get on that. And I think that this saves so much confusion and trouble and misunderstanding. And it is really the foundation for you as a representative of your organization, knowing what you want your volunteers to do, and your volunteers knowing what they're supposed to do and maybe what they're not supposed to do. I think it is really, really critical. And so often so many troubles can be avoided with this very simple document. And it is very simple. I think sometimes it maybe feels a little daunting for folks to put this down, but I would say if you have a good sense of what your volunteers should do at your organization, you could write this up in 10 minutes. Yeah, you might need to edit it a little more. A couple people might need to look at it, but 10 minutes of your time, you got 10 minutes. A bullet pointed list of what volunteers do, maybe addressing a couple things that they don't do, something that you share with the volunteers so they've got a copy, they know what they're supposed to do. And every few years you'll take a look at it and make sure it's up to date and edit it. But this is really the foundation of a volunteer program. But if you got more time on your hands, there's some other stuff you could do to really support your volunteer program. Because I think that volunteers are most successful when they know what they're supposed to do and they have a good sense, and you're not just throwing them into the deep end. And we want successful volunteers, right? So I think a few things the volunteer should have and that your organization should provide: a volunteer handbook. Now, this is going to take more than the 10 minutes. I'm not going to lie. But if your organization already has policies and procedures and rules and all those things already written down someplace, that's like half your handbook right there. So just plug those right on in, and then add a few sections about things that specifically volunteers should know about: who's their supervisor, what to do when they need to call in sick, and how do they record their volunteer hours and things like that. Plug those in, wham bam, you got yourself a volunteer handbook. I will say, and this is not a sales pitch, but I will say for one of our benefits of membership at AAMV is we have sample documents that we encourage you to plagiarize. And we got a volunteer handbook in there. You remember, you can pull that up, you pull out the parts you like, you put your name in the relevant spots. Easy peasy. So definitely keep that in mind, but put together some sort of something that's a written document about what volunteers do at your organization. Once you've got that and you've got new volunteers coming on board, it's great to give them an orientation. You can go over the handbook with them. You can show them where they hang up their coat. You can tell them about where they need to park. They get a sense of where things are at your site. And then obviously position specific training. If you want people to do things a certain way, you should probably train them to do them that way. That's just pretty obvious, but I didn't want to skip it here. All right, so who's supervising the volunteers? Now, we just saw that about just under 60% of the folks on this call are volunteers supervising fellow volunteers, and I'm going to talk about that in just 1 second. First, I'm going to talk about the situation where we have paid staff supervising volunteers, because I do think that supervising volunteers is different than supervising paid staff. And so I always like to do, a little bit of training for staff members if they're supervising volunteers for the first time, or maybe they've never supervised anyone at all. And I do think it is different, and it comes down to a couple of things: expectations and motivations. So I expect my volunteers to know their position description, which I've written up and handed them, and they've got a copy of, to understand their job. They've gone through some training, they understand that. But I don't expect volunteers to have this wider sense of how everything in the organization works. And I don't expect them, particularly if we have paid staff, to deal with irate visitors. I don't expect them to clean toilets. I don't expect them to do a lot of things that paid staff do if you have paid staff at your organization. And like I say, I know that doesn't count, that isn't the case for everybody. But the expectations are different. Paid staff are probably there 20, 30, 40 hours a week. They know the ins and outs, and they have a wider job description, certainly probably, than your volunteers do. The second part of this is motivations for being there. Now, if you've got paid staff, I hope that they're there because they just love their job so darn much. But I bet they also enjoy getting that paycheck, which allows them to pay their rent. Maybe their health insurance is tied to their employment. It's a whole thing we won't get into. They're good standing within our close-knit cultural organization community. They've got paid time off, they've got paid sick leave. All of these things might apply for paid staff, and their motivation for showing up for their shift is probably their love of the museum, yes, and those other things too. Now, volunteers are giving their time to your organization because they love your organization so much, and that changes the relationship they have with your organization, and that their motivation is to give to your organization, and it is not tied up with paying rent and health insurance and all of those other things. So I think when I look at those, what I expect from volunteers and their motivation from being there, that's how I change how I'm supervising volunteers versus supervising staff. Now, when you got volunteers supervising fellow volunteers, it can get a little sticky sometimes, can't it? So I think the best thing to do here is to be really transparent about how decisions are made, what the, if there, for lack of a better word, what the hierarchy of the organization is. Is there a executive board that makes the final decisions on things? Is it a democratic process? Everybody votes and then we decide on, who wins. Whatever it is for your organization, be really clear with everybody about how it works. And if you've got a volunteer and their volunteer role is supervising other volunteers and coordinating schedules and all of that, be really clear that they're a volunteer, but that's their job as a volunteer, is they get to tell other volunteers, hey, I need you to work on Saturday for your volunteer shift, or whatever the case may be. I think that transparency goes a long ways to making people feel happy. And I think also in general, when you've got an all volunteer board, there should be, and I think you could put this in the handbook, there's that baseline level of respect for each other. We're all giving our time together, so we're all going to be respectful. Like, we should always be respectful of other people, but especially thinking about, so nobody's going on some power trip, but just sort of keeping that present in your mind, that the respect for each other, that we're all giving our time to this organization, can go a long ways to avoid some of those struggles. Okay. Communication, that we're just sort of talking about that, but I also think communication does a lot to create community within your organization. So I think it's important to have a plan for how the organization is going to communicate to volunteers. And maybe that's a newsletter that gets emailed out. Maybe you got a Slack channel. Maybe once a month you get together and there's a meeting and somebody reads the announcements of what's coming up. But have a plan. Don't just rely on word of mouth, or, oh, I'm sure they'll all find out eventually. Have some plans. Have some formal ways of communicating to your volunteers. Also have options and ways for the volunteers to communicate back to the organization. Who do they check in with if they need to call in sick? Who do they check in with if there's a problem? What if they got some amazing feedback from some of your visitors? Who do they give that to? Have some different channels and ways for volunteers to make sure they're getting what they need to communicate back to the organization. That should always be a two-way street of communication. And then I think for building community, providing opportunities for volunteers to communicate with each other. So maybe this happens at a social 15 minutes before a training or something like that. But having ways for volunteers to get to know each other and communicate with each other, I think is key. So many people volunteer for a social experience. That might not be for everybody, and it might not be the primary thing, but it often is a part of why people volunteer. So I think we do our volunteer program a real disservice if we keep volunteers really siloed and they don't have a chance to sort of come together and really communicate with one another and build that community. Okay. Feedback and evaluation. So this first one, it says assess individual volunteer performance. It sounds like I'm saying do very formal performance reviews. I am not saying that. I have found in my years of working with volunteers that they tend to not enjoy really formal assessment processes and performance review type of things. That tends to go poorly. So I think that well, if you really want to do something formal, I know a couple organizations that pull it off okay. I think that a better way to assess volunteer performance is much more informally and checking in with volunteers and making sure somebody who's new understands their job description and checking in with them after they've worked a couple of shifts and checking in with them after they've been there for a few years and make sure it's still working for them. I think those things can be really informally done. Likewise, I think it's great to survey if your volunteer program is meeting your volunteer needs. And that can be a formal assessment. Some people love to fill out a survey. And it's a great way to get feedback about how your organization is serving your volunteers or what your volunteers need from your organization. And then I think it's great to remember, like every 5 or so years, to make sure your volunteer program is still meeting your organization's needs. Our organizations change over time. And sometimes we need to change our volunteer programs over time too. So making sure that it is truly meeting the needs of your organization. So you should keep track of some data around your volunteers. Contact info, it's a pretty obvious one. Emergency contact info, pretty important. I like to ask volunteers to report their demographics to me. And then I'll compare those with my, county census information to see if my volunteer program reflects my community. And that's often a great place for me to look at where I might need to do some more work of some recruiting or some outreach to some different communities that are not represented within my volunteer program, if that's the case. If you do some sort of trainings or assessments, people have to pass the certification before they can drive the train. This is a great place to keep track of that. Tracking service hours and years of service. Here's how I like to do it. I like to provide a mechanism for my volunteers to keep track of their own service hours and report those to me. And that might be a sign-in sheet. That might be a prompt each month. They need to email me total number of hours, whatever works for your organization. Provide a mechanism and they track that. I always track the years of service because nobody can ever remember what year they started if they've been there for a while. So I keep track of that. And then obviously you should track current volunteers, but I think it's really helpful to keep track of former volunteers. I often have been asked, hey, Jenny, do you know this person? We're suddenly getting memorial donations in their name and we can't find their records anywhere. And I look back and they were a volunteer 15 years ago. So I think it's helpful to sort of have a sense of your volunteer program through history. So I'm a big fan of that. Now I have volunteer management software ? At the bottom here. There are a few companies that specialize in creating software specifically for volunteer management. And I think it kind of depends on the scale of your program. If you've got less than 50 volunteers, you can probably do most of what you need with an Excel spreadsheet or other Microsoft Office products. That's not a sales pitch, by the way, just statement. If you've got more than 100 volunteers, I think that it might be worth looking at putting some money towards volunteer management software. And there's a few of them, and the price ranges are there's quite a range of prices. This happens to be a screenshot from Volgistics. I'm not selling you Volgistics. I'm happy to talk about the pros and cons of Volgistics if you want me to at the end. I just had a screenshot of it, and it was a good visual for this. So I think, yeah, maybe worth it if you've got a larger volunteer program, because a lot of the software programs will do things like scheduling your volunteers and tracking those hours for you and tracking when they're due to get the recertification on the train driving. And you can email this group and not this group, or you can email everybody right through the system. So they do have some fancy features, which is why you have to pay more money for them. But like I say, I think that's overkill for really small volunteer organizations. Speaking of money, turns out volunteers are not free. This always comes as a real shock to the finance department every time. But while we don't pay volunteers, if your organization has a budget, probably some of it should go towards the volunteer support. And that may be staff and paying someone that is coordinating your volunteers. That may be program infrastructure. So you decide you do need to look at getting Shiftboard or Volgistics or something to coordinate your volunteer program. There's a cost to that. And I do think, particularly if you have volunteers who are serving for long amounts of time, recognition, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute, but sometimes some money towards recognition is an important thing to really acknowledge that time that your volunteers are giving to your organization. So, you know, I don't know any volunteer programs that have amazingly huge budgets. So it's often not a ton of money, but it is something to think about when your organization is putting together money. And it's sometimes it's easy for some people to be like, volunteers, free. They don't need any money. Not exactly true. So I think it's important to look at every aspect of your volunteer program and think about how DEAI principles are integrated into that, looking at your recruitment, your onboarding process, the type of trainings you do, all of those things, and look and see where there might be barriers to volunteering. Are there people who are not able to volunteer at your organization because of when your trainings are, or the type of application process you have, or maybe you require background checks? And I'm not saying don't require background checks. I'm saying systemic racism in our judicial and law enforcement systems means that certain people are more or less likely to pass a background check. So thinking about, instead of saying you have to pass a background check, saying we require a background check and we consider on a case-by-case basis. Things like that can be a way to change those barriers. If your organization is really looking to implement DEAI lens across your volunteer program, and you already have a volunteer program, do some training to your current volunteers. Let's bring them on the journey with us, because it's not going to be a great journey otherwise. But what an opportunity to really transform your volunteer program with your volunteers participating with that, and they're learning about implicit bias, and they're learning about microaggressions, and they're understanding the journey that your organization is going on. And I will say that maybe some people don't want to go on that journey, and that's okay. You don't always have to bring people kicking and screaming. So it might be time to part ways. I'm not saying that that's easy or pleasant, but I'm just saying that sometimes we do everything possible to bring everyone along with us, and maybe we don't always need to. Maybe if somebody isn't, if your organization is going one direction and somebody says nope, then that's a time to say, thanks so much for your past service. Then maybe we'll see you around. Something to consider. I will say that AAMV has a DEAI toolkit specifically for volunteer programs. It is free and available to everyone. It is excellent, and it has actionable items. So there are things you could do tomorrow, and there are other things that will take you much, much longer to do than just tomorrow. But it's a great resource, and I definitely encourage you to check that out. Risk management, everybody's favorite thing to talk about. So what do we think about when we think about risk management and volunteer programs? The things that come up, I think, are theft, volunteer gets injured, volunteer injures visitor, damage to collection, confidentiality breach. Those are kind of the common ones that come up with volunteer programs. So I think it's important to put some things in place to mitigate that risk. I think background checks is one of those. I definitely encourage you to not only rely on background checks, because please remember, a background check will only tell you who got caught. Just the truth. I think volunteer training and supervision will go a long ways to mitigate a lot of risk about what are appropriate behaviors for volunteers, what they should and shouldn't be doing, and sort of so that somebody doesn't think, oh, I should just move this object in the collection, and they don't have training to do that. They already know, because they were trained, that they're not allowed to do that. It's just sort of one of those background things that happens and has wider implications. If your volunteers have access to confidential information about financials or things like that, great to do a confidentiality agreement. And I like to always be transparent about what sort of information should be kept confidential, so that people don't accidentally reveal something that they shouldn't. Liability waiver, probably a good idea, whether we like it or not. We live in a kind of litigious society, so it's good to have a waiver in case anybody gets injured while they're volunteering. And then I think good to think about conflicts of interest that might arise with someone who's volunteering for you, and maybe what they do in their professional life or their role on the board or things like that. Good to at least give some thought to. So I hope nothing ever goes wrong, just in life in general. That's always my hope. But it turns out that sometimes things do go wrong. And I think with a volunteer program, it's important to have a discipline and dismissal policy, and you should put it in the handbook, and you should share it with the volunteer, and they should know about it. I think that the one listed here is a really simple one that a lot of people use. I like it because it's easy to remember, and I don't have to like refer back to a manual on what step 7C is in the discipline policy. It's, you get a verbal warning, you get a written warning, you still can't pull together, you're out. And I like to be clear that we can skip to right to you're out if it's warranted. If somebody's stealing objects from the collection, I'm not going to be like, here's your verbal warning. No, you're dismissed, and the police will be in touch. But it is important to have a process for when things go wrong, because nothing will go right forever. So it's good to have a plan for that, and something you can easily pull up and rely on and say like, okay, I need to do the verbal warning. Okay, this is what's next. Okay, we're going to move into talking about recruitment, retention, and recognition. Keeping an eye on my time. I know I'm talking a little fast. I hope that's okay. So, like I say, this is a taste of volunteer recruitment. But I think the key to most recruitment is advertise specifically where you want volunteers to come from. So, if that's local publication, if that's a particular community center, a college or university, specific neighborhoods around your organization. I don't know about the Nextdoor app. Maybe yours is nicer than mine, but it's something to think about. But put out advertising where you want volunteers to come from. If your concern for your organization is, maybe volunteers are all on the older side and you don't have a lot of younger volunteers. Well, are you only volunteering at the senior center, or are you also volunteering at the community college? Like, think about where you want folks to come from, and put your advertising efforts there. I think, word of mouth is how a lot of people end up volunteering, and bring a friend events are great and can bring some really dedicated folks into your organization. They might not always check the diversity box on that. But I think that, being realistic, that volunteers who are happy are going to talk to other volunteers or other people and tell them how happy they are. And those people are going to be interested in volunteering. So, have signage about volunteering at your organization. If you have a check-in desk, put a sign on it that says looking for volunteers, and a QR code or a link to where they sign up. If you've got volunteers already, have them wear a button that says volunteer, or a lanyard that says volunteer. So often people assume that anyone they encounter in a museum is a staff member. And this can be a really simple way to reveal to people, I could be one of these volunteers here. And I love to partner with other local museums and organizations to share recruitment leads. I think it's not a competition, right? I want us all to win. But previously, when I was the volunteer manager at the largest museum in my town, I had lots of people who wanted to be a docent at my museum, and we never had openings for docents. But I knew some smaller organizations that did have openings, and it was always nice to be able to like send folks over there. And likewise, I could never recruit enough horticulture volunteers because nobody thought about my organization and thought gardening. So I partnered with the botanical garden and said, hey, you got more people than you can place? Send them my way. I think that partnering and sharing resources is a really great way to build community within your community, but also for recruitment. However you find volunteers, have a simple application, and I think do an interview. I think have a chance to sit down with somebody and get a sense of what sort of experience they're looking for, what sort of things they might bring to your organization, and they get a sense of what sort of commitment this is. I think that's a great first step. So you've recruited some volunteers and now you got to keep them. So I think that nobody says it like this, but I think the real work of volunteer management, like 90% of it boils down to like, keep your volunteers happy. Like people who are unhappy are not going to continue volunteering. So if you want people to stay and they enjoy their experience with you, keep them happy. So a few ways that you can do this. They probably are volunteering at your organization because they love your organization or your subject matter. There's something about your organization that appeals to them, right? So are there continuing education opportunities that you can throw their way? So maybe there's a lecture series that volunteers are invited to, or you could put together, or better yet, have your volunteers put together a book club where you read a book each month about, the whatever your subject matter of your organization is, and just sort of keep people really engaged in that way. We talked about communication already. It continues to be important. Your volunteers should not find out major announcements or things that are going on in the newspaper or on the radio. They should get a heads up about stuff like that. Whether it's good news or bad news, they should get a heads up about something that's going to be it's going to be talked about in the community. For a lot of people, they volunteer, and one of the sort of perks for them is access to staff, if you have staff, or subject experts, or maybe those sort of special experiences like the behind the scenes collections tour, things like that is not available to the general public. So thinking about how those can be integrated. For perks, I put the symbol of a coffee cup specifically for a reason. Sometimes with perks, food is the perk for volunteers. But if you've got a break room where there's a coffee machine, can volunteers get a cup of coffee there? Can you negotiate with the bakery across the street that volunteers get a 10% discount if they show their volunteer badge? If you charge admission, your volunteers should be getting in for free anytime they want, for it pretty much. And you should be giving them guest passes to give to friends or family. And maybe even they have the opportunity to earn a free membership after a certain number of years of service or hours of service. So thinking about ways that you don't have to break the bank, you don't have to throw them a party or a catered meal every time they come in, but are there little things that you can do that are a little bit of a perk or a little bit of a special thing for volunteers? And then above all, I think treat your volunteers as valued team members. Recognize what their accomplishments are publicly. Maybe that's on the website or in a newsletter. Make sure that you are inclusive of volunteers when we're talking about the successes of the organization, and make sure that they are valued team members. And sometimes, in this, I think, applies for organizations if you do have staff. Sometimes you need to specifically remind fellow staff about volunteers and their contributions, and sort of make a little bit of a point of that, because I think sometimes staff get a little one-track minded about who does what at the organization. All right, volunteer recognition. I've got the best news ever for you guys. The most important one on this list is the first one, Everyday Simple Recognition. It is free. It takes 3 seconds to do, and it is very easy, and it looks like this. hey, thanks so much for volunteering today. Really appreciate your help. We got a lot done. That's all it is. It's saying thank you when someone comes in to volunteer, and you do it pretty much every time they're there. It really is the most important of all of these. Like if you have a once a year party and that's the only time you're thanking your volunteers, that's lousy. Like I say, it's simple, it's easy to do. People skip it, and I don't know why. But I think when someone's giving their time to your organization, thank them for giving their time to your organization. Now, you want to have a once a year big party? Do it. I don't think it has to be like, champagne fountains and past hors d'oeuvres. It can be, that sounds nice. But it could also be a potluck picnic in the summer where everybody comes together and we talk about the accomplishments over the past year, thanks to the volunteer efforts. If you've got volunteers who've been sticking around for some time, I think it's nice to track and to provide some recognition for milestone hours or years of service. And that could be, once again, in the newsletter, on the website, at the once a year party. You buy them a $4 pin that says 5 years of service, and they put it on their volunteer lanyard and show it off when they volunteer. And then National Volunteer Week is the 3rd week of April. And it's always nice to sort of recognize that with your volunteers. And there's lots of simple things you can do. One thing that if you're in, and I know we've got folks from all over, but if you're in the Puget Sound region, a lot of us do a reciprocal admission that week. So we get a list of who's participating, and then we send that list to our volunteers and say, hey, you get free admission to all these organizations this week if you show your volunteer badge. So if you're in Puget Sound area and you're not on that list already, holler at me. I'll put you in touch with the person who does that. But I don't know why other groups in other regions couldn't do that too. It's pretty simple to put together. There's not a big cost to it. And it's sort of a special thing for volunteers. Okay. Whew. There's a lot of talking. Here's some resources. I've mentioned AAMV a few times because I love them so much and it's a great organization. The toolkit's there, the sample documents. Membership is required for that, but it's only $35 because we know that you don't have much of a budget. No museum does. There's slides from past presentations. There's a networking forum, lots of great resources there. Check it out. If you're starting your volunteer program from scratch, American Alliance Museums has an excellent toolkit. There's a cost for that, but once again, I think it's under $40 and it's quite good. I'm trying not to be too Puget Sound specific, but there does happen to be a managers of volunteer program roundtable quarterly meeting for the folks in the Puget Sound region. You can email me to be added to that list if you're not already on there. And then I added Volunteer Pro and Points of Light here. They are not museum specific, they're national organizations. I often find they have really great resources about statistics about volunteerism that are helpful to know, or articles or resources. So I threw those on there because, like I say, I look at those fairly regularly and they've got good stuff. And the good way to get a hold of me, once again, aamvmembership1@gmail.com. I try to keep my museum or my volunteer stuff separate from my other museum stuff in my brain, and that's how I do it, is that way. So questions and answers is where we are at, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen because that seems like the right thing to do.
Oh, perfect, Jenny. Thank you so much. There were so many ideas there. And I'm really grateful to a lot of our attendees who shared some things that have worked well for them at their organizations in the chat. So I will, this video will be uploaded to YouTube, and the chat should be visible. So you'll be able to see all of those as well. And yes, Gracie, I will share the PowerPoint in a follow-up email with everyone. So 100%, you don't have to write notes. So just to kick us off, and please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat, and then I can facilitate that, or may ask you to unmute and ask Jenny. But there was a question following up on your comments about bringing volunteers into the DEI work of the organization. And the question was sort of, does that typically focus on volunteer interactions with visitors and what that looks like in a kind of inclusive and equitable way, or what can other DEI trainings for volunteers look like?
I mean, I think it certainly can focus on visitors if that's an area where you feel like volunteers could use some reminders or some help, or like I say, maybe there's a shift in how you're approaching some stories or histories within your organization. I think, you know, something, and I want to be sensitive about how I say this, so I'm trying to sort of think it through as I'm talking, but I think sometimes if we have a volunteer program that maybe is a little homogenous and we're suddenly bringing in folks who are different ages, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, genders, um sometimes there is a little bit of a problem with newer folks being welcome into this group that's been volunteering together for a long time, maybe. And I think doing some work around that and being really clear with your volunteers about, you know, why your organization is taking this direction and what that means. um I think it's important work to do, because if a new volunteer comes in and they really feel othered, or they're constantly getting, the only thing anybody talks about is the thing that's different about them than anybody else in the group, they're not going to stick around, and all of the work that you've done to recruit them is undone. And it's not maybe malicious in intent. I don't think it's malicious. I think it's that sometimes we have a tendency to point out the thing that's different about somebody from us. But if you have 40 people and they're all being like, "Oh, you're so young," and everybody you talk to is like, "You're so young," it's wearing, and it doesn't make you want to come back for your second volunteer shift. So I think bringing folks along, and I think that's why I think particularly implicit bias and microaggression training can be really helpful for volunteers to be a little more inclusive of others coming into the volunteer program, as well as inclusive of visitors who are visiting your organization. You certainly don't want any of that going on there either. So
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Jenny, and you know, so many of the organizations. I know some of you on the call. You know, you need more volunteers, right? You just do to keep. I mean, you're having to limit the hours that you're able to open to the public because you don't have enough volunteers, and so creating a welcoming culture, as Jenny just described, I think is just vital for some of us to keeping our organizations healthy and thriving. Yeah, yeah. Yep. Great. Trent, thank you for that. There's just, I hope that folks will scroll through the chat. There's just a lot of really wonderful ideas, both around kind of like policies, and then just some of that culture stuff. And it's so funny because some of you will mention things, and then like Trent mentioned, just a simple thank you goes so far. And of course, Jenny emphasized that the recognition piece doesn't have to be expensive or complicated. It can be pretty simple. Um, are there any other questions that folks have that have come up for you, that you'd like to feel free to unmute and kind of ask here, or something you'd like to share with the group? I can share an anecdote from my own experience as a brand new college graduate, knowing I wanted to work in museums. I had a 9 to 5 job in a different field, and so I started volunteering at a museum, and like monthly volunteer meetings were always like at the end of the day, but I didn't have enough time to get to them from my job. I always missed the beginning of these meetings because I'd hop on the subway, I'd race uptown, it'd be like 5:30 or 5:45 before I could get there. And inevitably I missed some vital information that was shared only in those meetings. And then I was giving a tour. Anyway, it turned into a disaster. There was somebody from the New York Times on the tour. They quoted me on the tour. I said something in direct opposition to whatever was told to the volunteers in that portion of the meeting that I missed. It was sort of like worst case scenario. And I felt bad about that for a very, very long time, but now I'm realizing that that volunteer program just was not particularly inclusive of folks like me who were working 9 to 5. And that either that meeting time needed to be changed or that information had to be shared, should have been shared in other ways. And that's how I've assuaged my guilt over
yeah.
these many decades.
I think if the information is that important, it needs to go out in a couple different ways. Like,
Yeah, right? Gosh, yeah. Boy, I got called out. Anyway, Nancy has a question. Oh, yeah. So, what are some specific tips you have for recruiting and working with like remote volunteers who might be doing things from home?
Right. So I think that as a profession, volunteer managers made great strides with this very suddenly, starting in March of 2020. Whereas, not a lot of people used a ton of remote volunteers before that. So I think that we did see that there are possibilities for remote volunteers, and we did see that it's different than having folks in person, right? So I think the first thing is really being clear about what that role is and why it needs to be remote. And maybe it needs to be remote because the person who wants to volunteer with you is in Vermont, and they physically can't come in for their shift here in Renton, Washington. That's a great reason for it to be remote. I think that yeah, being kind of specific about what the role is. And I think for recruitment, it's really finding the person who is the right fit for that remote role. And for some people, that will be really attractive. That idea that they can volunteer from the comfort of their own home and they don't need to trek in, and that they can do this work and they can do it maybe even on their own schedule. Maybe they're doing some sort of research or behind the scenes stuff for you. So it's sort of being specific about that role. It's being really thoughtful about that recruitment and making sure it is the right fit. Because if it's someone who wants to come in and they're doing the remote role because that's the only thing they've got, that's not going to work out.
Yeah.
Um, but I think still being mindful of how you can integrate remote volunteers into your volunteer community. And that might not be the thing that they're always looking for. Like I say, sometimes people who are looking for that more social side of volunteering are not going to sign up for the remote role. But still making sure that that communication is happening, that it's not that they have to attend the in-person meeting, like Allison was missing to get the information, that there are opportunities for them to still be integrated and have information. And then I think for remote roles, it's also great to really have a conversation with those folks about what their expectations are regarding that sort of community side of volunteering beyond just the recording hours and logging in and logging out and doing the specific role. So I think those are the things that come to mind for me.
Yeah. And somebody mentioned earlier in the chat too about accessibility and volunteers with disabilities, and some kind of remote volunteering option might be something of interest. But then you still want them to feel a part of the community, and so thinking about maybe the book club meets by Zoom or
Yeah.
something like that, right? That could be more inclusive. Um, I love that Joe mentioned that free parking is a great perk for volunteers, right? And depending on where you are and how much parking you have, might not cost you anything, but be a real incentive for sure. And then we have another question. What do you suggest to reboot a volunteer program and bring volunteers back who may have felt neglected or burned in the past? This is a great question.
Hmm.
Volunteers who have not necessarily felt valued, how do you kind of reignite that relationship?
I mean, the place my mind goes first is, okay, well, who neglected and burned them, and is that person gone?
Yeah.
Because if they're still there, that ship might have sailed. But yeah, let's say yes, you maybe had a terrible person working there before, and they're now gone, and we're dedicated to it being different. I think you can be. I mean, if they know that they were neglected and burned, then I think you could be pretty transparent about that. That hey, like we know things didn't go well in the past. Here are the steps we're taking to change up how we support our volunteers. We would love to have you back. And I think, I mean, if you've got like 100 volunteers that were neglected and burned, this might be a heavy lift. But we're talking about like a smaller group, like I think some one-on-one conversations, call them up on the phone and say like, hey, I'm the new volunteer manager here, I've been briefed on the history of what's been going on here, can do you have a minute to talk about some things, and let them know. And I mean, even if the most you get out of that conversation is you apologize, like maybe they never want to come back, but they at least got somebody who acknowledged it was crap and that somebody apologized for it.
Closure.
Closure, that's right. So yeah, I mean, for me, so much of the way I manage volunteers is being transparent about why decisions are made. And I know that every time, there's always something that's like a secret and I can't tell the volunteers this or, for whatever reason. But whenever I can tell volunteers the truth about what's going on, or I can be transparent about a change that's being made or why a decision is being made, I think that if we're treating volunteers like valued team members, then transparency is a part of that. And sometimes that includes some dirty laundry, or some things that maybe shouldn't have happened the way they did. So I respect confidentiality of my organization, and if I am told no, that's not something volunteers can know the nitty gritty details, and there are sometimes nitty gritty things that not everybody gets to know. But if I can tell them that, sometimes I'll say, I can't share with you the reasons for this, but this is the decision being made. And they kind of get like, oh, something's going on there.
Yeah.
So transparency.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jenny. Um, any more questions before we say goodbye, or anything anybody here would like to share? Okay, great. Well, I just want to thank Jenny so much. I feel like there were some really useful nuts and bolts kind of suggestions here that would be a great starting place for anyone on the call who is trying to generate and create a volunteer program, or if you're just fine tuning things that could be improved within an existing program. I will share in my follow-up email to everybody some of those links to a
MV.
MV. I'm getting the V's and the M's confused. AAMV, so that you can connect with that organization if you'd like to, and I'll share Jenny's email address so that you can reach out directly. But look, this is a huge, huge topic, and volunteers and successful volunteer programs don't exist in vacuums in your organization. They're connected to how successful you are with your exhibits and your programming and community engagement and all of that, right? That's how people know and care about your organization and want to give their time to you. So this is going to be a conversation that's ongoing and continuous. And so do please feel free to email me if you're having a particular challenge or struggle that we maybe should organize a conversation around, because chances are you are not the only organization trying to crack that nut. And so we'd love to kind of have a conversation together. So again, thanks, Jenny, and look out for an email from me before the end of the day, everyone. And thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody.